Everybody, and welcome to today's AOP Live webinar. I want to thank you so much for joining us. My name is Philip Heidson. I'm the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. I'm joined on screen right now by Kelly Barner, who is my co-founder at Art of Procurement. Kelly, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, this is one where you certainly have a lot of background and experience in. So the topic today is around supplier diversity. The title of the webinar is Simple Steps for Growing Supplier Diversity. We're going to look at things like spend being a baseline to fuel your supply diversity growth, what kind of actionable data you may need to influence decision makers around supply diversity and driving impact at scale and longer term change. Now, if you haven't been involved in an AOP Live before, we do encourage you pop some questions or put some chat in the chat functionality in the tool. You'll see that. I'm just looking off to my side. At the side of your screen, so there's a chat and a Q&A functionality. So both Kelly and I will be keeping our eyes on that throughout the conversation and be bringing in as much as we can to pose to our guests. Now, we're joined today by Lois Eichacker, the VP of Customer Success at Supplier.io, and also Daniel Dorr, who's the VP of Marketing at Supplier.io. So let's kind of get away from the logistics into the conversation and welcome both Lois and Daniel onto the stage. All right, welcome as we get our cameras and our microphones all set. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us. We're just waiting. There we go, Lois. All looking good. Thanks for joining us, first and foremost.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Now, Lois, let's kick things off. We've got a question for you. You obviously talk to an awful lot of supply diversity program managers. I wonder if you could share what's some of the most common questions that you hear.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So, a lot of our customers have mature programs that have been in the business for a long time, and the questions that they pose tend to be very specific to, their programs. Mm-hmm. But when we work with newer programs just starting in supplier diversity, that's where I start to see more common questions, and they're along the theme of what are the rules, what diversity categories should we be tracking, and things of that nature. And mm-hmm. It really becomes an aha moment for them when they find out that there are no rules, for the laying out the foundation of a program, and that it's really important for them to have the confidence to look internally to their organization so that they can determine how to most effectively tie supplier diversity to their businesses and organizational goals.
Yeah. So it's interesting, not just a lift and a shift of a program from one organization to the other, but really taking into account the internal culture and specific requirements. And so I'm sure we'll get into that through the conversation. Daniel, anything that you have, any observations to add to what Lois shared?
No, the only thing I would say is there are no rules, but there are definitely better and worse ways to achieve the results that you decide. So if you and your organization define what it is you want to accomplish and why you're in the business of supplier diversity and what you expect it to do to help your organization, there are some really, the good news is there are people, as Lois said, there are people who've been doing this for more than 10 years. And there's a lot of good experience out there that we can all learn from.
I don't know, as an organization, you spend a lot of time kind of gathering research, best practices from across a number of different supply diversity programs to kind of give some of those guide rails, but also to share what some are doing, what they aren't doing, what's working, what's not working. And that's definitely going to inform some of our conversation today as well. Now, Absolutely. Speaking of data, we actually ran a poll on LinkedIn. We always do that now for our AOP Lives, just asking a question which would be interesting to kind of build the first part of our conversation around. And so I'm going to read this out for anybody who's not watching it via the video, but listening perhaps afterwards in audio format. The question that we asked was, which of the following activities presents the greatest challenge to your supplier diversity program? And the answers were, number one, drive longer term change at 48%. Number two, achieving impact at scale is second with 28%. Number three is establishing a solid baseline at 12%. And number four is accessing actionable data, also at 12%. Now, when we had a quick look at this, Daniel, before we started, you had a little bit of surprise, I think, in the results. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you would have expected or ordinarily thought that you would see here.
Yeah, it was very encouraging when we look at so these questions to me also line up with the maturity of an organization. If you are just getting started, as Lois talked about, you're probably establishing a solid baseline. And from there, you're making sure you're accessing actionable data and your data is accurate and reliable versus sort of any kind of manual process. And then you start working on achieving impact at scale. And then you start looking at even longer term change. And that was one of the best practices we saw from companies that have been doing this a while, was looking at taking the long vision and looking at change from a longer term perspective. So very exciting to see it at the highest percent, that driving longer term change. And I hope that means that the listeners out there, that you folks are doing great with your supplier diversity programs, and you've already got your actionable data and you've established a baseline, and really now it's looking for a longer term impact, which is very exciting to see.
Lois, any thoughts from your side on those results?
When I looked at the results, I really kind of interpreted them as the difficulty of achieving, each of these objectives, as opposed to kind of where they are doing them or accomplishing them. Like I really think that driving long-term change is incredibly difficult, especially in an environment where there isn't the staffing, the budget, necessarily buy-in to do all of the things that are required, the many things that are required to get and achieve long-term change. But I think that it's probably, in my opinion, probably more difficult to get impact at scale. It's easier to work on the margins, and a lot of times because of budget constraints, that's what we do. But that doesn't mean that that's kind of less important or than achieving long-term change. It's just something that is harder to do and maybe not as top of mind, because top of mind are the things that we need to do on a day-to-day basis. And I would echo in terms of, even though getting data and accessing data is lower ranked here, I think that kind of clouds a little bit the fact that there are a lot of companies that still have challenges here. So, if you look at the bigger scheme of things and the importance of these items, yes, they're probably lower ranked, but there are still significant challenges to getting the data to use to kind of drive the other changes that are higher kind of on the scale here.
And the establishing a solid baseline and accessing actionable data are really the foundations of being able to, that you then build upon as you mature your program.
Absolutely. Yep, that's the starting point for achieving a program that is going to go everywhere. You got to know where you're starting, what you have to work with to determine and set a strategy that will actually take you where you want to go. So it's a critical baseline for sure.
And you talk to a lot of supply diversity managers. Where is the focus, the balance of focus typically between addressing short-term challenges, perhaps supporting individual projects versus being able to take a bigger picture and a longer-term view?
I think out of necessity, the focus is on kind of the shorter-term challenges, keeping that program going day to day, year to year. And so you've got to overcome those shorter-term challenges to, stay in the game long enough to be able to tackle the longer term. So we find that many of our customers don't have the luxury of having, the staffing, the budget, et cetera, to focus on longer term things, and are kind of selling their business case over and over again. So, it's not surprising that a lot of focus is on short term, but the important thing is that when you do the short term things right and can demonstrate success from those short term things, and really importantly, communicate those successes both inside and outside, it kind of helps to smooth out the pathway to getting the funding, staffing, commitment, et cetera, for the tools, people, processes required for that longer term impactful change.
And so I'm going to ask anybody who's watching, I'm really interested to know what the current maturity is of your supply diversity program. So if you pop in the comments in the chat, it'd be really interesting to see how you feel, how developed you believe that your supply diversity program is. In the meantime, Kelly, I'm actually going to come to you with a question, because Kelly, you were, I kind of teased at the beginning, you spent a lot of time in the supply diversity space, and that included a big project as part of the LinkedIn Creator Accelerator last year, where you did an awful lot of research into supply diversity. I wonder do these results surprise you?
So, the funny thing about these results, and I looked at this before, but listening to Daniel and Lois speak to them, just sort of like letting them hit me somewhat fresh today. I actually think if we were playing this in the Jeopardy version, right, where you're given the answer and you have to provide the question, and I covered up this question, I could look at those 4 responses with this distribution and point to a lot of things in procurement. So I think one of the things that it reinforces for me is that supplier diversity has advanced and matured in many organizations such that it is being handled very much in line with procurement's other work. And I also think, longer term change management, impact at scale, always dealing with data. That's what we're seeing across the board, regardless of the objective that we're trying to achieve. So hopefully what that means is that as we attack these challenges in any area, all of the areas that are dependent upon our ability to overcome these roadblocks improve all of the initiatives. So that's sort of what comes to mind for me in terms of these results.
Right, well, I appreciate everybody's insight into it. It's really interesting to see as these came in. I want to pivot a little bit and bring Daniel, you into the conversation. Let's talk about foundations, the foundations for growth. We looked at those results as kind of what are the foundational parts, what are the areas as you become more mature. What do you see from the most successful programs?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of different research throughout the year in partnership with you all, as well as, through our data. And one of the things we did was we looked through over $4 trillion of spend data to try to figure out what is the difference. And we identified the top 20% of the programs. And what we saw was these programs were getting about 2 to 3 times the results of their peers. So we thought, well, geez, we got to find out what they're doing, right? Obviously, they're doing something different. And what was fascinating to us was, first of all, they're not necessarily doing different things. The staff was about the same size. The length of the program, some had been only around for a year or 2, others had been around for decades, right? The budgets that they had, none of those things that we always associate with mature or high performing programs really paid out. What we did see, though, it was how they used the tools that they had that was significantly different from their peers. And one of the big tools, as you saw in your poll there, was data. What we found was that the leaders, those that again are getting 2 to 3 times the result of their peers, use data a little bit differently. And one of the things that we found that they did was the level of detail. So most of us, we look at our diverse spend and we report, hey, we got a 3% or a 4% or a 2% or whatever that diverse spend is. And many of us are being called into the executive room to provide updates on this. And Kelly, I really like your assessment there about how supplier diversity and procurement are maturing, and we are being held to the same standards as any other part of the business. So for example, if you were in a product division or you were in marketing or sales and you went up and gave one number, that wouldn't be the end of the conversation for any other department in the company, right? You'd be looking at, the details of that number, right? How that plays across the company, et cetera. That's what leaders do. Leaders don't go in and just say, this is we got a 2% spend. They will go in and say, this is our company spend. This is what it is, Phil, for your department, Kelly, for your department, Lois for your department, or location or what have you, so that they can see how the results compare across the company. And then they spend time looking at what's working and not working and actually forecasting out, okay, next year we want our spend to grow 1%, 5%, 10%, whatever that number is. And Kelly, it looks like you have some opportunities in your department. So we're going to sit down with you and forecast that out. So this is a real maturing of how we look at supplier diversity. We're not just targeting a number. We are infused in the business in these leading organizations, and the numbers are critical to the business unit or location level, and it has a big impact. That's one of the most important things we saw. And I think, again, your poll may be hinting to that just baseline data, that's, I think, sort of to steal a phrase from you, Kelly, it's like table stakes, right? Now it's like, what are you going to do with that data? And leading organizations use that data much more detailed and much more business focused.
So, I think about so we're embedding the process of supply diversity and supply selection and the kind of into the business planning and the forecasting process, so that it has those organizations who are leading in the space have it embedded into their goals, essentially their performance metrics. It's something that at a enterprise level, a level above procurement, does drive down into the system for them to achieve certain results. Is there a baseline, or sorry, not really a baseline, is there a benchmark of what spend, and I'm always wary with this because it's so situational, what kind of spend is possible? Let's paint the art of the possible in terms of striving to or setting aggressive objectives towards achieving for those that are succeeding in supply diversity.
Yeah, I think this is where we have to have a mix of the company's goals versus what's happening in the industry. So overall, across all industries in 2022, diverse spend was about 3.4%. Sorry, 3.7% across all organizations. But depending on what industry you're in, that number could be half. That number could be twice as much, sometimes 3 times as much, depending on your specific industry. So that was the first part. It's very volatile based on the industry. And then those top 20% of programs tend to be doing 2 to 3 times better than even that number, right? And so that's where the opportunity is. But again, it depends on what your company, that's what the industry is doing, but you got to be very careful. What is your company trying to achieve? What level of support do you have? What is the goal for this program? We worked with Hyatt recently, for example, and they were recognized for Supply and Demand Chain Exec Top Procurement Award, Project Award. And one of the reasons they got that was they hit their 5-year goal in just 3 years. And a key part of their goal was they wanted to do more with African American run businesses, and they empowered their locations, the different properties, to be able to make it easy to find diverse suppliers. So that was their both business and their community goal. So for them, it was rooted in being a great member of the communities that they lived and worked in. That might be different for different organizations.
Yeah. Lois, we talked about spend as a metric of success, but I imagine it's not the only metric of success, and there's actually other ways that performance can be measured and monitored of supply diversity programs and the strength of those programs. Are there any other kind of metrics that you see within the organizations that you work with as different performance measures other than just amount of spend in a program?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I feel relatively passionate about. I guess my passion list is getting longer and longer, but I think that the count of diverse suppliers you're using is very important. We have customers, love them, but you have customers that have a whole lot of diverse spend with a very few number of suppliers. And that makes me question, is that the real intent, of supplier diversity? So looking at the number of diverse suppliers is very important. And the other thing that I think is critically important, if you're really going to look at the strength of your program and the impact that you're driving, is what is the average contract size for your diverse suppliers? Because again, you can have 1 million diverse suppliers, you spend $1 billion with one of them and exactly 2 cents with the rest of them. Again, you start to question, is that really the goal and the impact that supplier diversity wants to have? So I think you really have to take a bigger, broader look at numbers. If you're talking about impact and what you're trying to do, impact means number and scale. And, that means number of suppliers and contract size.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but that's the measure of the impact, really, is number of suppliers, and not just going and saying there's these 3 or 4 easy suppliers that I can go to and that fulfills a spend goal. But that's not necessarily having the impact behind the intent. Kelly, I'm going to come to you in a second, but I do have a question, Daniel, for you before I go to Kelly. What role does the economy play in the emphasis that you see placed on supply diversity? Do you see it being cyclical, or are we at this point where supply diversity, regardless of the health of the economy, has become a truly important measure and kind of strategy within a lot of organizations?
Yeah, I think we talked about this with y'all last year, in fact, right? Going into 2023, we were concerned that as the economy was going to start to be less robust, shall we say, that people would lose focus on supplier diversity. And we weren't sure exactly how that was going to play out, but we had significant concerns. And so we are actually in the middle of our 2023 State of Supplier Diversity research right now. I think we just closed it down on Friday. So I can't give away all the results, but one of the questions we asked was, what impact, if any, has this had on executive support, your willingness to be public about your programs, all those kind of things? And across the board, very positive, very positive. Executive support has not waned. The interest in the programs has not waned. I think the one thing we are seeing is budgets are tough, like any other department, right? But the support and the willingness to be public about the supplier diversity programs remains incredibly high. And in I think about 20% of the cases, companies said they were going to double down as a result of the challenges they're seeing in the economy and other areas. That not only were they not going to let it take them down, they were going to be pushing harder. They were going to be more public, more aggressive.
Mm-hmm. That's very promising to hear, because you worry that other priorities, from a procurement perspective, it's suddenly expense management, cost, nothing else matters. But I see that procurement now is being expected to manage everything. It's not that, okay, this part of the economy, we're going to focus on this thing. When the economy changes, we're going to focus over here. It's how do we balance that across, whether the economy is good or bad. And that's, I think, a positive for us, because it demonstrates that we can make an impact across create more of a value proposition for the organizations that we work with, as opposed to being the SWAT team that comes out and saves money when the company needs to save money and then kind of get putting back in the box when we don't.
Yeah, and I think this is a really nice bellwether for us in procurement, that we're not going back to being the cost people, right? Yeah. For the last 3 years, we were strategic to the company. We got the seat at the table. People knew we were important, not just for cost control, but for risk management, for brand value in terms of the impact we're having on the communities we serve, our supplier diversity programs, all part of the value that procurement offers the company. None of that has gone away, and it looks like it's not going to. So we're in it. We're in it for the long term. We're in it to stay, and that's great news, right? And again, as you looked at those data results, we're all stepping up, it looks like, which is really exciting to see.
I think it's exciting if for no other reason than maybe that flywheel would have gone back around, right, and shoved procurement back into the savings quadrant. But we were the ones that made our own backstop and said, no, right? This is a case where being overly short term actually diminishes everybody's potential longer term. If we stay, we've talked a little bit about data as a challenge, and we've talked about benchmarking or baselining. We can think about baselining in a couple of different ways, Lois. One way would be to think about, okay, what's my day one spend, number of diverse suppliers, number of contracts, contract value. That's one way to look at it. But another way is actually to baseline the data and the information that we have. What's the most common starting point that you see? There's this first sort of attempt to understand where are we today in terms of supplier diversity. What's the common case starting point from an information understanding standpoint?
Yep. The common information point is really understanding the makeup of your current supplier database or your current suppliers. So truly understanding what their certification statuses and the diversity categories that they fit in. And it's interesting to us, a lot of the first times when we look at customers' data, that would be the first time that they even know, and their buyers know, what diverse businesses are we currently using. And that kind of that quick way to get a jump start in your spend is to do more with the diverse suppliers you're using. And that's, usually a very valuable early piece of information, really understanding who you're currently using and working with. So there's that piece, and that helps you to know where you are, where you're starting. And then the second piece of data that helps to start things to become more actionable. You kind of got a baseline. Now, what do we do to become more actionable is to then get access to a database where you can find new, qualified, certified, diverse suppliers to use. And so getting that access is that second key step that we see a lot of our customers do. And then third is the benchmarking, not for setting goals at this stage, but to understand the overall possibilities of the potential for the program, which lets you then kind of figure out, taking your mission and vision, how does that look and how do we step it out over time?
Now, you mentioned this idea of looking at your suppliers and seeing who's certified. And I can see we have a question that's come in from Brad that's about maybe one of those rules people are questioning when they start their supplier diversity program. You can be a diverse owned business in any of the categories, but not necessarily be a certified diverse owned business. What role, or maybe what I should ask you is the role of certification changing, or is that still remaining sort of the de facto go get a certification from an appropriate organization and maintain that certification, or are the definitions and the categorization starting to expand a little bit?
So I would say for our customers that do a lot of external reporting, internally to the C-suite, but C-suite reporting externally, they want that certification. They do not want to be embarrassed by coming out and reporting a number to find out that, a company self-reported a status that, couldn't be verified. So I think that certification status is critical at a point, but I also think when you are looking at potential diverse suppliers to use and who's the best supplier to fill my upcoming opportunity, I think you can relax that certification kind of lens and look at widen your net with the hope and understanding that, if they become a potential contractor, that they will be willing to get certified. But I think you definitely broaden the net when you're looking for potential diverse suppliers. But when you've got diverse suppliers in-house and you're reporting, accurate certification data is critical. The embarrassment factor is immense.
Yeah. Now, Lois, one more question for you around sort of this data and transparency. If there's a common case for what people find when they start looking at their data, are there any common case blind spots or things that they don't find that might actually, if you visually think back to the poll data that we put up, where we've got data and baseline, and then it goes up to driving change and impact at scale, are there any common blind spots that make it difficult to go from what that baseline is to longer term, larger scale impact?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the things that, can look great at the beginning, and we kind of hinted at this earlier, is to find that one or two diverse suppliers we have huge spend. And that can look great out of the gate, but that's not the way to a long-term sustainable program where you got to develop muscles at continually finding qualified diverse suppliers to feed into the RFP funnel. So, pegging success on, that immediate ability to get, high level spend with a few suppliers, I think is a real blind spot. And another blind spot that's a challenge for programs that are starting is taking benchmarking information and using that to establish goals. Mm-hmm. And there is nothing more demotivating to the buyers that are your boots on the ground that are the lifeblood of a supplier diversity program than giving them a benchmark based upon top performers that have been in the business for the last 20 years. You need to start with a reasonable goal based on where you are when you analyze that baseline. So that's another blind spot that can really catch folk. And the other big one is that I've seen, we see customers come in and then it's renewal time. It's kind of like, sorry, we're not going to be able to renew, is that they jumped in too fast without doing that important groundwork to get the buy-in from those buyers, again, boots on the ground, as well as sometimes hiring the organization. You got to have that buy-in before you're going to get sustainable programs.
Now, Daniel,
Kelly, I just might add to that one thing on the bias also, or the blind spot is, one of the things we're finding is supplier diversity data is relatively volatile. We see about 20 to 25% churn annually. And so a lot of us are, I'll collect the diversity information at the start of the year or as part of my onboarding, and that's good enough, right? So there's this idea of, that good is good enough. Now, I don't know about you, but there's very few times I've presented to executives where I felt like being about 20% inaccurate was acceptable, right? And we're seeing programs where the data quality, because people are looking at, we spoke to one CPO, and when he took over a program, the prior individual had set up the diverse spend based on who quote unquote seemed diverse. And the results were highly inaccurate, up to about 50% false positives as a result of that. And again, if we're going to be strategic to the business and we're going to be presenting to the executives, we have to be accurate, right? That's you can't be off on shipments between 20 to 50% off, or off on revenue or sales. The same comes for us in procurement and supplier diversity. We wouldn't accept that kind of data and numbers for our cost savings. We certainly won't accept it for our supplier diversity one. And so I think we see a little bit of that. Again, I think it depends on the maturity of the programs, right?
Yeah.
Folks that focus on data have done a really good job. Some folks may feel like, oh, this number, I already have this because of onboarding and such. You could be between 20 to 50% inaccurate as a result of that.
Now, one follow-up question for you on that, Daniel, and then Phil, I'll give you a chance to jump in and ask some questions. We think about benchmarking, and this could be anything, just to help people understand the dynamic. My first thought whenever something is being benchmarked is I want to look at the data set and see where I fall or where my team falls so that I can figure out if I'm, to use your phrase, good enough. Where do I sit on the continuum relative to the average, relative to peers? But we've been talking about granularity of data and precision of information. And I know from some of the research that your team has done that it's not necessarily helpful to look at all companies everywhere over all time and try to benchmark yourself against those to figure out if you are good enough. What are some of the different factors that you have seen make a difference, both in terms of trying to figure out who you should be benchmarking against, and then maybe identifying some opportunities, even if you are good enough, to get better?
Yeah, this has been a real learning journey for us. A couple of years ago, people were doing their own benchmarking studies. We know a lot of supplier diversity managers will go to conferences and sit shoulder to shoulder with peers and even sometimes competitors and talk about what your spend is like and which suppliers are working for them and which are not, et cetera. And so we actually built that into our data set and into our solution so that people could go in and you could actually see, based on your industry and size, where you sit versus your peers in a similar scenario. And we thought that people would be so excited. They'd love to see that number, right? They were going to take that number into their C-suite and say, look, this is where we are. And they'd use that to set goals. And we saw some of that. And this is part of the amazing part about supplier diversity managers is they didn't really care as much about what the number was. What they cared about was how to make that number better. And so the later version of the solution that we offered actually allows people to see what category of spend they are under and overperforming versus their peers. Again, it's that level of detail that gets most important because that's what drives action. And they wanted to be able to see, how are we doing? What are we doing well versus our peers so that we can acknowledge that? And probably even more important to most of the supplier diversity managers we work with, where can we learn from our peers? What specific categories? And as Lois said, which specific suppliers can we start working with that might help us grow our diverse spend? And so it very quickly went from, I want to benchmark myself against my peers to, I want to learn from my peers, get into the details, find out what they're doing well so that I can become better. And we've been talking about this, by the way, Kelly and Phil, about diverse spend, but we can do the same thing for small and diverse spend as well, because we know some programs are really focused on the small side as well. So just depends, again, back to what the program is trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and that was actually a comment we got from Paul saying that, a lot of industry seems to solely focus on diversity and not on small business. He was saying his company collects data and reports on both. And I imagine different industries looking at different kind of classifications in terms of what falls under a supply diversity program. But it's really interesting to hear one, kind of that move to real-time data and reporting versus looking back in the mirror and looking back at the spend analytics and saying, well, last year this was the number. And you kind of spending the next 12 months living off that number that gets to be 12 months old versus actually having some real time so you can see the impact of decisions that you're making. But also what was fascinating was, Daniel, when you were saying then around, you look at benchmarking and you think, okay, how can I create competitive advantage against my industry peers? And that's how we often use benchmark data. But that's not necessarily how it was being used. It was being used to say, okay, kind of, am I in the same realm as my industry? But there's this desire, regardless of benchmarks, to improve, continuous improvement, to drive more impact. And it's the impact that is a driver, as opposed to just a number that says, well, we're better than our competitor A and that means that we win, which is oftentimes what a lot of benchmarks are used to do.
Yeah, which is one of the beauties of supplier diversity is, and they've been doing this for years, by the way. We go to matchmaking events. Lois, you've been over 20 years going to these events and meeting with customers. Competitors will sit in the same room and share ideas and so forth. And in fact, we spoke with one business services company. They really love their supplier diversity program and they bring them into all their sales deals. Part of the reason is because they're highly networked. They know their industry. And when they have, when they need to work their way into a company and talk to, people within the company, supplier diversity managers always know who to talk to.
Yeah. Now, in the interest of time, I'm just going to pose one more question, then come back to you, Kelly, to start talking about the long-term vision. But Lois, I had a question around kind of influencing stakeholders. And do you have any best practices or any advice on how to really influence decision makers to include diverse suppliers in, not only the RFP process or the contracting process, but then in actually making awards as well?
I think that there are things that can definitely be done to influence the entire process. And I think that the most important thing is to make sure that, when you come to the table with a diverse supplier, they better be good. Make sure they're qualified, kind of in every way, so that, it is an impressive company that is truly a contender for the business that is, up for bid. So that is probably the first and most important role. The other thing is to establish those relationships within the business, because to really get where we want to be with supplier diversity, we have to want to be able to do prepping and coaching and make sure that we've got and identified the suppliers that, are good, potential vendors, but that requires lead time. So the closer the relationship we can have, and with collaborative relationship where we can get lead time on knowing opportunities long before they happen, is going to be critical for us to get where we want to go. And again, the vetting and training, ahead of the RFP gives them the advantage. And then I think the other piece that can be really helpful is to find those current diverse suppliers you're currently using that are successes. And then showcase those and the, strategic and cost saving and innovative and market driven difference that they've made, the impact that they've had as a company, and showcase those. Having a success story that is within your company can be really compelling to see that, if we've done this once, we can definitely do it again, and kind of even create a little competitive spirit to trying to increase that. So I think having a great success story to communicate and showcase can be important as well.
So I do just have one quick follow-up. So it sounds like what a really critical piece of this from a buyer perspective, from a procurement perspective, is supply development. So actually thinking a little bit more strategically, you said about understanding what's coming down the pipe in terms of opportunities, and actually helping to develop a diverse supply base who is ready to come and, become part of a process and a selection process at the right time. And that's a key part of what those that are succeeding and having the most impact are actually doing.
Absolutely. And, that takes a deeper level of commitment, investment, involvement. And it also shows you're not playing by the short-term hockey stick rules. You're playing the long game and you're going for impact. And it takes a work to develop a supplier to be a strategic supplier, so they can fit into one of your strategic categories. And that is a long-term game. We have, for instance, one of our customers, Ford, takes a 3 to 5 year, look at that. And they know what's out there, they know what's coming, and they will actually bring some of those diverse vendors in at the design phase. So that's a really important component when you talk about impact, driving impact versus, showing improvement and kind of stepwise.
It's interesting you referred to Ford there, because that's where I used to work for Ford at the very beginning of my career. So that's kind of where we learned a lot about supply development and the benefits of supply development, and how you can really get your suppliers ready so that there's been work put in for the time that it's time to basically come and showcase them. But Kelly, I'm going to hand over to you to start talking a little bit about long-term vision.
Sure. So one of the things that I've found is interesting, even from the conversations that I've had within supplier diversity, is that there's sort of a traditional situation that happens. Somebody in the C-suite goes out and makes a lofty vision statement, a beautiful soaring mission, vision, goals, objectives. And then they turn to procurement and they say, here's this beautiful dream. turn it into action steps. And the challenge of going from where's this place that we are all aligned around that we want to get to 3 or 5 years in the future. Well, there's a whole lot of individual days and decisions and relationships and contracts that have to be managed before you can reach that point. Based on your conversations with clients, Lois, what advice would you give sort of for in that moment where procurement is handed the vision and there's buy-in everywhere, but somebody has to turn that into an action plan that can be executed to drive that change? What would you say for that moment?
I think it's a critical moment. I think that it's really important to come and develop a realistic action plan to tie back to that vision. Otherwise, you're going to be setting yourself up for failure right from the start. If you can let people think that you can achieve this lofty vision in 3 years, and then you don't, that's going to be setting yourself up for failure. So you got to really quickly put your arms around, what are the numbers associated with this lofty vision, and then looking into an analysis of our current purchase profile, what contracts we've got coming up, what are the size of those contracts, what diverse suppliers do we currently have, what is our funnel for getting new diverse suppliers, to really have a solid plan at a category level for the steps we can take towards that vision. And once that's outlined to really kind of realistically what that can look like, then to communicate back, this is a great vision and mission. This is kind of the plan and the time frame that we can follow to accomplish it, and building in milestone dates, objectives, and all important feedback loop to come back and kind of report back on progress and to course correct and maybe refine that original mission and vision based on kind of the hard lens of reality sometimes.
I love that idea of the
sorry,
feedback
Kelly,
loop. Go ahead,
other
Daniel.
option I would encourage folks to do is look for the bright spots within your company already. So it was really interesting to us when we did the best practices research to find there were some companies were really quite surprised that they were already in the top 20%. And for example, M&T Bank we spoke to is a regional bank. Part of the reason they did so well was because the banks were members of the community. Like supplier diversity and buying and working with small and diverse vendors in their community was how they wanted to live and work. So it was already happening. It was an interesting example of a grassroots program that was being built by the people on the ground. And so, when he took over that program, it was really easy to start activating what was already there, right? So he didn't come in and say, okay, this is what the executives are saying and take it from a tops down approach. He activated what was already happening by people living and working in those communities, supporting small and diverse suppliers there. Hyatt did something similar, right? It's taking advantage of those folks at those locations who already have a passion for their community. So those are a couple ways that we can also look for what may be winning already, even without the executive level support, and then using that to fuel some of the hard work and the processes and so forth that Lois outlined as well.
Yeah, and I think it could be an important kind of step. I mean, what you're really trying to do is here's our lofty mission. This is where we are, and then finding out the plan to fill the gap. So if you're starting where you've got a lot of baseline success already, then kind of your plan and your runway becomes easier. But yeah, it is very important to know kind of what you got in place so that you can emphasize and build on those.
Yeah. And maybe just one comment and then Phil, I'll give you a turn. It's interesting to the extent that we're talking about creating virtuous cycles, right? We're talking about the fact that procurement has become our own backstop on not retreating into pure savingsville. And so, Daniel, taking these success stories, these bright spots, and getting to deliver those maybe back to a C-suite that didn't know about them. If we're discovering them, then they certainly may not have known about them. It's a celebration. It's an opportunity to highlight something that happened organically that gives the company some success to build on. But it does also selfishly give procurement that opportunity to say, look, I have all these things to tell you about. Some of them are savings, some of them are risk, but look at these other value-oriented programs where we've sort of been able to incubate this culture around third-party relationships and spending and what we do beyond just get products and services in the exchange of that money. I think it all sort of plays into not only trying to have a resource efficient company and make the progress towards supplier diversity that we want, but also plug into this natural incentive that procurement has to demonstrate the full breadth of the value proposition. So, maybe that's my little soapbox for a minute, but I like this idea of, yes, take the vision and turn it into something actionable, but also make sure you come back around that feedback loop you talked about, Lois. Make sure that they're getting information, good and bad, based on what's happening, and bring them into the conversation so that even if procurement's maybe not at the table for the first development or for the first big statements that are made, boy, are we a part of it from that point going on. And we're actually the ones that have the sort of boots on the ground credibility.
Yeah, and Lois shared that idea earlier, right? Everyone we spoke to, by the way, in the best practices research did exactly what Lois said. They all had a story in their hip pocket that they could talk about where supplier diversity helped them win business or achieve another business objective besides just growing diverse spend. A little while ago, we spoke to E2O2 over at Logitech. Whenever he gets calls and says, hey, I need to include supplier diversity in a contract, or RFP that they're replying to, he tracks that to find, did they win the contract? What happened with that contract? And he has a ready set of stories in his pocket to be able to talk about the role supplier diversity is playing in helping the company achieve their objectives.
So how big a part of building a business case for either initial investment or continued investment are those stories? Like what do you find are typically some of the key parts of building a business case for executives, for stakeholders to really buy into? Let's say that there's an understanding about supply diversity. Maybe there's some, early growth in terms of a program, but not a lot of maturity in about taking it to the next level. Like how do those conversations go, and how are those that are successful in getting the additional investment they need to build out, more robust capability?
Yeah, I can start with that, Lois, and if you want to jump in, part of it comes from where the demand is coming from. So, like we talked about, M&T Bank, it's a grassroots, it's coming from the ground up, right? And it's, Kelly, as you pointed out, being able to take those stories in and show the executive committee how working with small and diverse suppliers has a huge impact on their company goal of being a member of those communities and growing their business with the communities. And so that's one approach, right? Is giving visibility to what's already working and showing there. We do see many programs where it is driven from the executive team as well, right? Where a board member or the CEO has said, we are going to live our values. We're going to put our money where our mouth is, so to speak. And in those cases, it really is more around maturing at the level of the business, right? This is what you expect of other lines of business. It's our job to meet those same requirements. Kind of accurate numbers aren't going to work for right, if we're going to be reporting this back to you as the CEO or the board. And so really helping build that out the same way we would any other business function are kind of the two different ways we've seen it apply. Lois, I'm not sure if you've seen other ways as well.
No, and I think the ability to really connect to, the business goals and objectives and make a clear connection and have proof points, if you will, is really critical. And I mean, there are a lot of kind of bigger picture, wonderful things we want to do, but at the end of the day, if this isn't supporting us as a business and where we need to get as a business, it's going to, go the way of bell bottom. So, you've got to be able to create that sustainability, tie it to business. And we see our customers doing it, maybe from sales, it may be from measuring sales that would have been lost, sales that are won, new market penetration due to new products that a diverse supplier innovated. So there are a lot of ways to measure true impact, that really helps to sell that case in a meaningful way.
One of the ones we've been hearing a lot more about lately, especially as consumers become more brand focused and more responsible in their buying, is the impact companies are having on the communities that they work in. So we know by 2045, the projection is that by 2045 we will no longer have diversity, right? Half of the population or more will be quote unquote minorities by that point in time. So anyone with a consumer business, retailer, consumer packaged goods, manufacturing that sells direct to consumers, etc., is looking to grow with that diverse community and those diverse consumers. And so programs so that's one part of it. And again, people were asking about small. Buy small is a huge focus for a lot of organizations. So knowing as people as the supply chain becomes more transparent and procurement plays a bigger role in building out that transparency, we're seeing a lot of this also tie back to the brand and the impact that the company can have directly with consumers, not even the large corporate buyers.
Yeah, and I'm reminded a couple of cases from my career. One, a giant Californian healthcare company who were all about investing in the communities which they served, because that's ultimately where their customer base was as well. So it was really important that they not just be seen, but actually kind of put their money back into local community. And the other is a large CPG organization that I worked with as a consultant a good number of years ago. But their position was every single person that you deal with as a procurement professional is a potential customer. And so every single interaction that you have is also a potential customer interaction. So you got to be really careful in kind of, one, your interactions, but two, in terms of let's maximize the impact of these dollars that we have to spend across as broad a cross section of companies as possible, as opposed to just putting it all into, a few baskets. Like a lot of procurement strategies are, which is all about spend consolidation and just get one supplier in each category and things like that. But that really took away from, the ability to spend within the community. I know that we're coming up on closely coming up on time, but I do want to ask about, we talked about, and Lois, I'll pose this to you first. We talked about getting buy-in. And so we've got buy-in, there's a business case, there's a program that exists. Procurement never likes to be the police. We're often told that we're the police, and that's where we have a bad reputation sometimes when we're, kind of throwing policies and mandates in front of folks. How can we think about, for areas of the organization or even individual stakeholders that are not necessarily really engaging in supply diversity, how do we manage that? How do we report it? How do we govern it? Is it, putting it up the chain and so having some difficult conversations, or are there more effective ways that you've seen to bring some folks on board that just may not see the business case?
If they don't see the business case, it can sometimes be a hard sell. You can certainly, I think you need to bring those things that are connected to the business and that are, data driven and objective and, kind of irrefutable. I think that's important. And hopefully, that should make an impression. And then, other things can help. Let's make your comp plan, make it so you care. You can't care because it matters to the business, and you can't care because it matters to our buying market and it matters to our, employee retention. Well, then, we can look at compensation and some other ways to affect that. But selling the business case is the hardest part. I think of supplier diversity's job. You got to be, diligent, and, persistent, consistent, and, really try to forge relationships and try to find ambassadors in different areas that can maybe pose the communication and the value proposition in a different way that, connects, resonates better than, in a better way than maybe, the way that you started out with the communication as well.
Yeah, and Phil, we saw the leading programs take a slightly different approach. So first of all, like we said before, they're looking at BU specific data, business unit or location specific data. So it doesn't take long if you're sitting in the meeting and you clearly don't care and your numbers are well below all of your peers for you to get the message that you're going to improve your program. So part of it is just purely, call it competitive spirit,
peer
if
pressure.
you will, in the business, like peer pressure. Yep. So that's part of it. The second part of it was a lot of the supplier diversity manager we spoke to. We heard this from Marcus over at Capital Group. He doesn't go in to sell supplier diversity. He goes in, he buys the business leader a cup of coffee, and he says, how can I help you with your business? And he turns the conversation to, what are you trying to accomplish? And I think this is what, Lois, you were saying before also, in terms of looking at longer term opportunities, right? Is not just saying, hey, I want to chase this RFP and I want to make day more difficult for you. I'm here to add, we as a company have defined supplier diversity as a value add for us as a company. It's my job to help you and your specific business unit activate on that in a way that supports what you're trying to accomplish. So it's less of a, it's a velvet glove, so to speak, approach, and a little bit of an assumptive sell. And there's plenty of opportunity with those types of approaches. We've also seen where that's worked very well for a lot of the programs that are a little further on in their journey.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily about how can I help you utilize a more diverse supply base, but how can I help you, around your challenges? And then as a procurement person, it's now your job to find diverse suppliers who can fit that need that helps them solve a challenge, and just kind of talking about it in a little bit of a different way.
Exactly. So a lot of business leaders right now are about managing risk.
Mm-hmm.
We were looking at Hacker Group data recently. Diverse suppliers tend to have about 20% longer life cycle with the company, for example.
Yeah.
You want to manage risk, diverse supplier could be a great way to do that, because they're going to be historically have been more loyal, more benefited from the company, and more aggressive in supporting the company in volatile times, for example. So that's a great example where we're not here to make you do supplier diversity. If you want to help manage risk, I have a tool, happens to be a small supplier, a diverse supplier, et cetera, that will likely support your business more effectively longer term.
And it's been an interesting shift in the business case. The way that, say, 2 years ago, what that business case looked like to what it looks like now. And so that's been a very interesting shift that is more reflective of the shift that you would need to see to make supplier diversity a longer term, impactful, long-term strategy.
Well, that's definitely encouraging to hear, and I think almost a good spot to close things out. But I do just want to ask, let's see, we have a question that came in from Lawrence. Lawrence was just asking about supplier databases, and are there supplier ratings or rankings within within just generally supplier databases, so that they can kind of look at almost like the Yelp for suppliers, or whether we don't really get into that level of granularity, and it's a lot about seeing, you can get data on who's being used, but not necessarily on how they are being used.
Yeah, I think, I don't know about you. I think we've all seen some questionable Yelp reviews that didn't reflect my personal preferences. Let's put it that way.
They may have involved all capital letters, for instance.
Yeah.
You never. So one of the things that we do is we have what we call a Trust IQ score, which is based on the likelihood of this candidate to be able to fulfill your business needs, and it involves how much time they've been in business, the size of the company, other organizations like yours that have been spending money with them, so that you can see the actual behavior, which is other people have chosen this vendor and they've had them for a while, et cetera, versus the sort of personalized reviews, so to speak, is the way we've approached that, frankly.
Yeah, and it's more about longevity and them being in business, and the fact that they've served people. It's not an indication that how good they were. We're not saying it was a great experience. We said they had an experience. So we, try to be clear about that we're not doing that kind of a ranking, but we're looking at, who has been used. And, that is a meaningful stat, though, in and of itself.
Yeah, and I've never really seen that within procurement. I think there's been a lot of discussion, and we've talked a lot about how wonderful it would be to have, when it comes to supply discovery, quality rankings and things, and yes, a certification and, quality certification and things like that. But I think the tools that I've seen on reviews are more internal collaboration tools versus looking at kind of what the market is saying about somebody. All right, well, let's wrap it up there. Lois, Daniel, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a lot more of your experience in the supplier diversity space. It sounds encouraging that it's really becoming more of a foundational business strategy, as opposed to something that I think in the past we've all felt procurement kind of trying to push a ball up a hill, a few years ago, to there's really a lot of demand, and there's obviously a lot of, from a tools perspective and a data perspective, we can really be a lot smarter in how we think about supply diversity. So really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
And Kelly, as ever, thank you for helping me ask the questions.
Absolutely. And thanks to everyone who joined us.
Yeah, we'll be back with more AOP Lives. Just to find out what we've got going on at any one time, feel free to head over to artofprocurement.com/calendar. That's artofprocurement.com/calendar. But until the next time, I want to thank you all for spending some time with us today. Take care, everybody.